Hey guys, it's Mr. Pedigo here, and we're reading the third and final part of the story of Odysseus, which is a story of homecoming, coming back after the end of the Trojan War, a 10-year siege. And we're going to jump right into part three. If you remember from last time, we talked about the sirens that Odysseus and his men faced. And we're going to see some other trials, some big ones in this next reading. And so I'm going to make a couple comments on this. Feel free to read along with me or just listen, whatever your learning method might be. Part 3, page 48. After passing the Sirens' Isle, Odysseus had to sail through a dangerous strait, now known as the Strait of Messina. In a rocky cave, on one side of it, dwelt a monster called the Scylla. It had 6 heads and 6 mouths. This is like a sea monster. Each mouth could take in a whole man at once. Near the other side of the strait was the Charybdis. And I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. I'm sorry if I am. A whirlpool that sucked down all ships that came near it. Now Odysseus saw that he could not escape both of these dangers, and so to avoid the Charybdis, he steered close to the Scylla. He orders his men to row fast as they could past the monster's cave. The ship fairly spun through the water, but Scylla was also quick. Darting out all her heads at once, she seized 6 of the crew. While she was devouring them, the ship sped past her. Odysseus escaped with the rest of his men. The hero now wished to continue his voyage without stopping. Remember, he's been at sea for a long time. Remember, he stayed on Circe's island after he broke that enchantment for a year, so he's been on the road for a long time. His comrades were so tired that he agreed to land for the night on the coast of Sicily. So they pulled their ship up to the sandy shore and soon were fast asleep. In the morning, a storm was howling about them. It would have been certain shipwreck to be put to sea. The storm raged for a whole month, and even the crafty Odysseus did not know what to do. To me, that might be another example of fate. Odysseus being kind of guided by fate and by the gods, kind of protected on his quest back home. The fact that they stopped that night and avoided that storm. Worst of all, though, their provisions began to fail, so the sailors made up their minds to kill some of the famous fat cattle belonging to Apollo that were kept upon the island, Apollo being a Greek god. Odysseus had been warned not to kill the animal and had ordered his men to leave them alone. One day, however, when he was away, his crew killed some of the cattle. They lit a fire and were roasting several pieces of beef when suddenly all started back in terror. The pieces of beef lowed as though they were living, and the skins of the slaughtered oxen got up and began to switch their tails, toss their horns, and gallop up and down the shore. The moment the tempest lulled, the men... Sorry, I'm sort of get distracted there. I had a message work-related. The men dragged the ship down to the shore and pushed off as fast as they could. So essentially, they eat these sacred oxen, these sacred oxen belonging to Apollo, and they kind of come back to life in a creepy way and kind of freak the sailors out pretty bad. They were not far out to sea when suddenly blackness covered the sky and a dreadful squall blew up. So they've angered the god Apollo. They're going to be punished for this in some way. The ship went to pieces and all the men were drowned except Odysseus, who was washed up on the shore of a lonely island. Remember, Odysseus was the one who said we should not eat those cattle. So he was the only one who did not disobey the gods. The island was the home of a sea nymph, Calypso. She treated the shipwrecked hero most kindly and became so fond of him that she kept him with her for 7 years. She promised to make him immortal if he would stay with her always. But Odysseus longed for home. So at last Calypso led him to the other side of her island, and there he saw a forest of stately pine trees. With a keen brawn axe he soon felled 20 trunks, and with these he built a raft, bidding farewell to Calypso, set out on his homeward voyage. So he's by himself. This guy's lost a lot of friends on the way. Soon a storm arose. Heavy waves dashed over the raft and broke it into pieces. The hero clung to the log and drifted on it for 2 days and 2 nights. The wind then lulled, and Odysseus, seeing land near him, swam to shore. Cold and tired, he gathered dry leaves, lay down upon them, and soon fell asleep. He slept all night and all the next morning. At noon, Nausicaa, the daughter of the king of the island, went to the shore with her maidens. Their talking and laughing awakened Odysseus, and the princess, on hearing the tale of his shipwreck, took him home to her father's palace. Here he was royally welcomed, and the very next day a ship was made ready. He was sent home to Ithaca. When at dawn the ship reached Ithaca, Odysseus was fast asleep, and the crew carried him out of the vessel, wrapping him in the rug on which he was sleeping. They laid him upon the sandy shore without waking him. When he awoke, he did not know where he was, but the goddess Athena. Now, Athena, as we know, is the goddess of wisdom, and she appears significantly. She plays a big role in the Iliad, which predates the story of Odysseus, but she's a very important goddess and very interesting goddess when she appears. I always get excited. And told him that he was on his own island of Ithaca, and that Penelope, his wife, loved him as much as ever. Then he climbed the rocky heights of the island and went on to the cottage of his swineherd, who invited him in. Without telling the swineherd who he was, he stayed at the cottage that night. Next morning there appeared the swineherder's home Odysseus' son, Telemachus, who had just come back from a long search for his father. Odysseus made himself known to his son, and they talked over all that had happened while Odysseus had been so far away. More than 100 men from Ithaca and their neighbors in the neighboring isles had come to Odysseus' place, hoping to marry Penelope as his wife. For months and years they had stayed at her palace, feasting and drinking at her expense, demanding that she should marry one of them. She told him that she could not wed until she had finished a shroud for her father-in-law, who was old and likely to die. She spent years making that shroud, and even yet it was not finished, for every night she would undo the work that she had done during the day. The suitors at last discovered the trick that Penelope was playing and refused to be put off any longer. They insisted that she must choose one of them for her husband. It was while they were doing this that Odysseus reached the home. Interesting. He planned a way to punish the suitors. He first sent Telemachus to the palace alone to see his mother. Then he dressed as a beggar. Odysseus followed with the swineherd. When he came to the palace gates in the rags and tatters, no one knew who he was but his old dog, Argo. Argo recognized him at once and began licking his hand. The swineherd led the way into the banquet hall. A few places behind him walked the ragged beggar, leaning upon a staff. The swineherd kindly gave him a seat and invited him to eat and drink the good cheer upon the table. Hardly had Odysseus seated himself when jests and insults were heaped upon him by suitors. It wrung the heart of Telemachus to see his father so badly used in his own palace, but he kept his temper and waited. Not long after Odysseus' arrival, Penelope entered the banquet hall. She did not know that her husband had returned, but Athena had told her what to do. See, here's Athena playing a cool role. She stood beside one of the columns that upheld the roof of the halls and said, "Hear all who are in this hall of Odysseus. You wish to take the place of my husband. I bring you his bow. Whoever among you can bend and string it, and with it shoot an arrow through 12 rings, him will I wed, and him will I follow from this fair home." Then the suitors, one by one, haughtily. So again, this is another instance where we're kind of being, a lot of Greek stories and myths warn us of hubris and arrogance and haughtiness and being conceited, etc. Really, we're kind of seeing an example of Odysseus kind of appearing very humble, but kind of, harkens back to the story of Achilles in a way. Humility is a big part of this, and Odysseus is presenting himself in a very humble way. One by one, they utterly failed to bend it. Odysseus then demanded that he, too, try to bend the bow. Amid sneers and laughter, he was at length allowed to do so. As easily and as skillfully as a skillful player stretches a cord from the side to the harp, so without any effort he strung the bow. Forthwith, through each and all 12 of the rings, an arrow winged its way. It was followed by another, which struck the chief man among the suitors dead. Telemachus and 2 faithful men who had already locked the doors of the hall now lent their aid to Odysseus. Arrows flew, swords clashed, clubs were swung until all the suitors who had tried to steal his wife and kingdom from Odysseus lay dead on the floor of the banquet hall. Penelope's joy was so great when she learned that the beggar was really her husband. Odysseus' delight at finding that she still loved him made all his weary wanderings seem like a dream. So this is a really interesting conclusion to the story. I want you guys to think about what the story tries to tell us and what we can learn from it. And I also want us to think about what the ancient Greeks might have been trying to communicate to young people in their culture, because these 2 things were really used in such a way. They were used as application to teach youth. So see you next time.